The only sound was the rev of a motor in the drive in front of the house, the throaty purr of John's car. She glanced at the bedside clock. Almost noon. Her stepfather always took his own sweet time, but he had no need to hurry to his office. Not since he'd married Mother. Of course, Mother always lauded him to the sky, said how lucky the island was to have a man of his caliber, inferring he was so successful. Successful at marrying a really rich woman, that was for sure. Damn John. She didn't like him. He was always snide about Kyle. How many times had John brought up the flagpole flap? For God's sake, it was years ago. A high school prank. Heather pushed away other moments when Kyle's daring and defiance had landed him in trouble. And now? Could she overlook his last wild escapade? Oh, damn, damn, damn. Thoroughly awake, Heather rolled from the bed. She stopped at the vanity, yanked up a brush to pull at her tousled dark hair. She didn't look at her face. She was likely pale as a ghost, with huge smudges beneath her eyes. Whenever she got upset, she looked like a wraith, all gray and silver, insubstantial as a ghost. She flung down the brush, walked to the French window. She pulled it wide, looked out at the familiar sweep of the gardens, brilliant with roses and hibiscus and bougainvillea. The wedding was supposed to be there at the gazebo. I, Heather, take thee, Kyle. Was there going to be a wedding? Lillian Whitman Dodd paused at the top of the steps, looked down the hall toward Heather's room. Perhaps she should go back, knock again. Clearly Heather was distraught. Lillian was surprised at her sudden feeling of dismay. That was odd. She should be overjoyed if this marriage didn't happen. She'd never tried to hide her regret at the engagement. She'd hoped Heather would outgrow Kyle, but she had never looked at another boy, not from the first moment she met him. Admittedly, Kyle was appealing, with an impish charm and good looks, but he was a disaster waiting to happen. Why now did Lillian feel sadness for her daughter? Perhaps because passionate love is rare, and when it happens, it is worth fighting for. Just as she'd been determined to marry John despite Heather's opposition. Lillian had been certain John was the right man for her from the moment they'd met. He'd done such a fabulous job on the promotions for the Art League. He had such an eye for color and the charm of a successful public relations executive. How lucky she was that he'd chosen the island to start his own business. He'd spent so many years in much larger venues. John was enormously empathetic. He knew how troubled she was about Heather. It was too bad Heather disliked him. She needed a man's counsel. Not for the first time, Lillian regretted Heather's romanticized memories of her father, Howard Whitman, wealthy, cultivated, charming. Lillian stood stiff and still at the top of the stairs. As always, when she remembered Howard, she felt a curl of ice in her soul. How could she have been so wrong? Maybelle Whittle carried her tray of cleaning supplies with an edge resting on one hip. She walked slowly across the room. Summer nights were good nights for the Haints. That's what Dr. Fox said. Maybelle's mouth opened. She gulped in air. She always had trouble breathing when she thought of the wizened old man who lived in a dark tumble-down shack at the end of a twisty gray road on the other side of the island. Dr. Fox talked in a silky voice, as whispery as a cougar rustling through the forest, about people who went against what was right and who treated people bad. Dr. Fox could make a root bag, and then those folks would do what you wanted. If they wouldn't do good, you could fix them where they'd never trouble you again. Her mind shied away from what he meant. That kind of talk could lead you into hell. That was what Aunt Esther claimed. But Maybelle knew there was truth in the old man's voice, no matter what her aunt said. Maybelle sighed. She'd better hurry, or Aunt Esther would be scolding her for taking too long to see about the cottages. At least this one was empty, and all it took was a lick and a promise. Maybelle opened the door, then stood still. Vanessa Taylor was going inside her cottage. A man stood on her porch staring after her. When Vanessa closed her door, fury turned his features into a mask of hatred. He stared at the shut door, his face ugly as sin, then turned on his heel, hurried down the steps. Maybelle didn't stir. She couldn't move for the life of her. The memory of those glaring eyes and twisted lips were seared into her mind. She'd never thought white folks had the power, but sure as the tides rose and fell, she knew what she'd seen. She'd seen the evil eye. City Hall on Broward's Rock was a modest one-story building south of the police station. Justine Pryor, the mayor's secretary, was the last person out of the office. She pulled the door shut, waggled the knob to be sure the lock caught. Not that they had to worry too much about crime. After all, the police were right next door. Justine glanced toward the station. Billy Cameron, the acting chief, and his wife Mavis, who served as secretary, dispatcher, and all-around helper, were hurrying down the front steps of the station. Seemed like Billy and Mavis were always in a hurry, on their way to a ball game, a meeting, a church group, or dinner with friends. They were laughing. Justine almost called out, then clamped her lips tight. Much as she loved Billy and Mavis, it would be worth her job if she tipped them off. What good would it do? Que sera, sera. Max Darling ambled along the boardwalk. The gentle breeze off the harbor ruffled his thick blonde hair. His blue eyes held a reflection of laughter. He looked toward Annie, winked. Annie Darling shot her husband an affectionate and just slightly impatient glance. Okay. There really wasn't any hurry this gorgeous August afternoon. There was the easy hum of activity from the harbor where yachts and sailboats rode in the pea-green water. A sail was unfurled on a ketch rig. An outboard choked and sputtered. Sunburned guests lined the rails of a boat returning from a morning of deep-sea fishing. Along the boardwalk, customers thronged the shops, buying everything necessary for a happy holiday. Beachwear, low-country baskets, jewelry, trinkets, and, of course, books. God was in his heaven, and all was right with the world on the little South Carolina sea island of Broward's Rock. The island was at its busiest during the dog days of August, teeming with tourists who needed beach books. The temperature was in the mid-90s and the air squishy as melting asphalt. What was more cooling than relaxing in a beach chair beneath an umbrella with a wonderful mystery and a jug of iced tea? As proprietor of Death on Demand, the best mystery bookstore north of Miami, Annie was happy to oblige both with books and with tea or coffee to go. Annie was in a hurry to get back to the store. In fact, she'd been reluctant to take time for lunch, though Max would certainly have been startled had she turned down an invitation to Parati's Bar and Grill, her favorite restaurant in all the world. There were, of course, books to unpack and customers to welcome. Deliberately, she shied away from the real reason for her rush. This was no time for Max to pick up on her thoughts. She slowed to a saunter. Surely she could pretend to be as relaxed as Max. Sure she could. No problema. She'd play it cool, and no way would Max realize she was in an itching, tearing, urgent hurry to get back to the store. She walked even slower. Max slipped his arm around her shoulders, gave a squeeze. Okay. What's the deal? Annie felt a moment of panic. Was all her hard work for naught? Had Max found out? During the last week she'd noticed that he'd occasionally shot her a quizzical, almost uneasy glance. Sometimes he'd looked ready to speak, his eyes alight with excitement. Then he'd turn away. Yet when she'd asked, he'd shrugged away her inquiries. Had he tumbled to the secret? He lifted his hand, brushed her cheek gently with his knuckles. Come on, Annie. If you were a microwave, you'd be pinging. A greyhound at the post couldn't be more ready to race. What gives? Is it the books you need to unpack? New books by Ridley Pearson, Lindsay Davis, Joanne Pence, Rochelle Critch, right? She felt such a rush of tenderness she almost cried. Damn! How perfect could a husband be? So, okay, Max could be dilatory and too laid back, and he and the notion of hard work had never meshed. But he was so attuned to her moods that her best effort to be casual didn't fool him for a minute. Of course he assumed she was eager to get to Death on Demand because of the slew of boxes that had arrived Saturday. And he cared enough about her and her world that he'd taken time to note the names of the authors on the unopened boxes.